We stay in the Indo-Pacific, where Japan and China have accused each other of violating the airspace around the Japanese-controlled East China Islands.
China Coast Guard 5303, this is PRP Dato Balinsosa, MMOV 3009. You must stay clear of our route. Over.
Imagine a few tiny uninhabited rocks in the East China Sea. No skyscrapers, no people, no cities, just waves crashing against barren land. And yet, those rocks might be the spark for the next big military showdown between two of the world's most powerful nations, China and Japan. What could possibly make these lifeless islands so important that they've pushed Asia to the edge of a boiling geopolitical crisis? Well, China claims them, Japan controls them. And recently, the Japanese Navy just made a bold move that might have drawn a red line China can't afford to ignore. This is the story of the Senkaku Islands and why they're China's biggest trouble. Let's start with the basics. The Senkaku Islands, known as Diaoyu Islands in China, are a group of 8 tiny uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. On paper, they're just 7 square kilometers of land. That's smaller than most airport runways. So why all the noise? Because location is everything. The islands sit smack dab in one of the most strategic and resource-rich zones in East Asia. We're talking potential oil and gas reserves, rich fishing grounds, and a front-row military advantage in the Pacific. Whoever controls the Senkaku Islands controls a crucial gateway between mainland Asia and the wider Pacific Ocean. But here's where it gets wild. Japan currently administers the islands, but China claims historical ownership. Taiwan also throws its hat in the ring, but the real heavyweight battle is between Beijing and Tokyo. So what's the deal? Who's right? Well, it depends who you ask. Japan says it incorporated the islands in 1895 after conducting surveys and finding them unclaimed. They argue that China didn't care back then. But China says the islands have been Chinese territory since ancient times, showing old maps and documents from the Ming Dynasty to support their claim. But everything exploded in 2012 when the Japanese government bought the islands from private owners. That move infuriated Beijing. Mass protests erupted across China. Chinese ships began entering the waters near the islands more frequently, challenging Japanese control. And that's when the tension dialed up. Since then, both nations have been locked in a game of high-stakes maritime chess. Chinese Coast Guard ships patrol near the islands almost daily. Japan scrambles fighter jets. Each side tests the other. Each side watches, waits, warns. But recently, something changed. Japan's Navy just made a move that China couldn't ignore. During a major naval exercise, Japan deployed its most advanced destroyers and surveillance drones right around the Senkaku area. Publicly, they called it routine, but everyone knew it was a signal. Japan was saying, "We're here, we're watching, and we're ready." That's a problem for China, a big one, because China's facing pressure on multiple fronts: the South China Sea disputes, tensions with Taiwan, and a struggling economy. It doesn't want another hot front in the East China Sea, but it also can't afford to look weak, especially not in front of its own people. National pride is at stake. And in China, nationalism isn't just a tool, it's a weapon. The government has spent years building a narrative that the Diaoyu Islands are Chinese territory stolen by Japan. If they back down now, they risk looking like they folded in Tokyo. That's political suicide. So what's the endgame? Japan is bolstering its alliances, particularly with the United States. The US has made it crystal clear that the Senkaku Islands fall under Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty. In simple terms, if China attacks the islands, the US could get involved militarily. Let that sink in. One wrong move, and you don't just have a Japan-China spat, you have a potential US-China military clash, all over a few uninhabited rocks. Now let's take a step back and think about how China sees this. From Beijing's point of view, the islands are part of a broader strategy. China wants to dominate its near seas, to push American influence back and secure maritime routes. The Senkaku Islands? They're part of that puzzle. Losing them means a strategic disadvantage in a region China considers its backyard. But Japan isn't budging. In fact, Japan is quietly growing its naval strength. It now has some of the most advanced submarines, Aegis destroyers, and anti-ship capabilities in the world. While China boasts a larger navy in numbers, Japan's is sleek, well-trained, and deeply integrated with US forces. The recent show of force was Japan's way of drawing the line in the sand without firing a shot. And guess what? It worked. China responded with protests and a few symbolic patrols, but it stopped short of any serious escalation. Because deep down, both nations know a war over the Senkaku Islands would be catastrophic. But the standoff continues. Every day, Coast Guard ships shadow each other. Fighter jets fly dangerously close. One miscalculation, one mistake, could ignite a firestorm. And here's the chilling part. There's no formal crisis communication channel between China and Japan in that area. No red hotline, no instant de-escalation plan. That's like playing Russian roulette, blindfolded. So what's next? Some experts believe this will be a frozen conflict. No resolution, just endless tension. Others fear that domestic politics or military accidents could trigger something far more dangerous. But here's what we do know. The Senkaku Islands are more than just rocks. They are symbols of power, pride, and dominance in the Asia-Pacific. And until one side gives in, which seems unlikely, this tiny group of islands will remain one of the most explosive flashpoints on Earth. So the next time you look at a map and spot a few specks labeled Senkaku, remember, they may look insignificant, but they represent a geopolitical fault line. One that, if pushed too hard, could unleash forces far beyond Japan and China. Because in the chessboard of modern power, sometimes it's the smallest pieces that carry the biggest consequences. But let's not forget, this isn't just a two-player game. Other regional powers are watching very closely. Countries like South Korea, the Philippines, and even Vietnam are eyeing the Senkaku tensions with concern, because they too have territorial disputes with China. If China successfully pressures Japan over Senkaku, what message does that send to smaller nations? That China can strong-arm its way through international waters? That alliances don't matter if the opponent is big enough? That's where the United States comes back into the frame. US military strategy in the region now revolves around something called the First Island Chain. This imaginary chain runs from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, and down to Malaysia. And guess what sits near the top of that chain? Yep, the Senkaku Islands. From a military perspective, holding those islands means monitoring Chinese submarine activity, tracking naval movements, and keeping a strategic eye on the East China Sea. For China, breaking through that island chain is crucial to expanding its influence into the wider Pacific. So this isn't just about oil or history or nationalism. It's a tactical chessboard where every square matters. Now let's get into some of the tech being deployed in this silent conflict. Japan has begun arming its remote islands with missile batteries, installing advanced radar stations, and even setting up mobile anti-ship units that can be moved quickly by sea or air. Their latest destroyers, like the Maya class, are equipped with Aegis combat systems capable of tracking hundreds of targets at once, including ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, China is pouring billions into satellite surveillance, drone swarms, and cyber warfare capabilities. Their Coast Guard ships are no longer just for show. They're increasingly large, heavily armed, and built for confrontation. This leads us to an uncomfortable question. Is a gray zone war already underway? That's the term military analysts use for conflicts that don't involve actual shooting, but still look a lot like war. Harassment of fishing boats, blinding, lasers aimed at aircraft, cyber attacks on communication systems, fake fishing vessels that double as surveillance ships. The East China Sea is crawling with these gray zone activities, and the Senkaku Islands are ground zero. But perhaps the most unpredictable factor in this entire drama is public opinion. In both China and Japan, nationalistic sentiment is surging. Chinese citizens are taught from school age that the Diaoyu Islands are sacred Chinese land. Japanese citizens see the islands as sovereign territory under constant threat. Politicians in both countries know this, and often stoke the flames for domestic support. No one wants to be the first to blink. And with no joint management system or treaty in place, every patrol, every flyby, every sonar ping carries risk. In fact, a single misjudged maneuver by a Coast Guard vessel or a jet pilot could escalate into a shooting incident within seconds. And if that happens, Well, we could be talking about the first naval clash between two major powers in the 21st century, with the US involved, possibly even dragging NATO into the conversation, depending on how far it spirals. Let that sink in. A 7-square-kilometer cluster of rocks could ignite a conflict that spans half the globe. That's why military strategists call the Senkaku situation a powder keg with a lit fuse. Everyone knows it's dangerous. Everyone,